Welcome to World War II Indiana Landmarks, Episode 19, the Japanese Memorial Band Marker in Bloomington, Indiana, and the story of Japanese internment in the United States. I'm your host, Ron May, author of the book World War II Indiana Landmarks. For our episode today, we travel down Interstate 69, southwest from Indianapolis, to the city of Bloomington, home of Indiana University and the Japanese Memorial Band Marker. The Japanese Memorial Band Marker is small and easy to miss. It consists of a rock with a plaque and a bench on a small grassy area outside of the Herman B. Wells Library. It commemorates the discriminatory ban on accepting the enrollments of 12 Japanese American students at Indiana University during the years of World War II, and it expresses regret for that decision. The ban on Japanese American students is an oft-forgotten period in U.S. history. To understand the ban's full impact, however, it is necessary to review another oft-forgotten and even more shameful part of U.S. history, the internment of Japanese Americans during the war. We turn our attention to that history first by focusing on one Japanese American family's experience. The Kanno family of Seattle, Washington, was among those 120,000 plus Japanese displaced and interned by the federal government. Kiyuma Kanno and his wife Kikuyo were both immigrants from Japan. They loved America, but were unable to become citizens because the Immigration Act of 1924 prevented it. The couple had 3 American-born children, Mary, and twins Jean and John. Jean and her twin brother John were born in 1926 in Seattle, Washington, while their older sister Mary had arrived 4 years earlier in 1922. In 1937, while Japan was already at war with China, Jean's mother took the children to visit their extended family in Japan. Jean and John were 10 at the time. When their relatives asked the children if they were going to move back to Japan, Jean replied, "Oh no, we're Americans." And indeed, they were. The Kanno family had a happy life in Seattle. There were few Japanese families living there, but they were well integrated into the community. Kids enjoyed school and friends. The family attended a local church. Their father owned a successful dry cleaning business. Jean played piano, her older sister Mary played violin, and John liked sports. The Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor forever changed their lives. Jean and John were in 9th grade and 2 weeks shy of their 15th birthday when, on December 7, 1941, Japanese naval and air forces struck the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack not only brought the United States into the war, it also triggered doubt on the loyalty of Japanese Americans living along the West Coast. The day after the attack, December 8th, Jean, a 9th grade student, sat in the school assembly listening to President Roosevelt announce the attack and declare war in his famous Day of Infamy speech. Jean recalled, "We were all ordered to the assembly hall for a special program and to listen to the president speak. I'll never forget it because I felt like everybody was staring at me. There were very few Japanese or Asian people that lived in my area. When they said the Japs attacked Pearl Harbor, I just felt like everybody was looking at me, like I dropped the bombs. I just felt so self-conscious. I wanted to run away." In the weeks after the Pearl Harbor attack, life for the Kanno family and other West Coast Japanese became increasingly restricted. First, there were curfews and driving limits. Then, acts of discrimination followed. Rumors began circulating of a possible mandatory evacuation. Barely 2 months after the attack, the rumors were confirmed by President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942. The order granted authority to the U.S. Army in the Western Military Zone to evacuate anyone determined to be a threat to the security of the West Coast. Only the Japanese were determined to be a threat. Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, leader of the Western Defense Command, used his authority to forcibly move the Japanese living on the West Coast. Officials posted signs in public places throughout Seattle directing Japanese residents, including college students at West Coast universities, to report on a certain date between April and May to specified transportation sites in the city for their mandatory evacuation. The Japanese exclusion area appears in the shaded areas on the map. It included half of Washington and Oregon, all of California, and the lower half of Arizona. Any Japanese residents living in those areas were determined to be a threat. Caught in the frenzied paranoia of Pearl Harbor, authorities feared that Japanese residents living on the West Coast might try to collaborate with the Japanese military in staging future attacks on the U.S. mainland. Within months after the order was issued, approximately 122,000 Japanese residents, 70,000 of whom were American citizens, were removed from their homes and transported by train to internment camps for the next several years. The Japanese families were permitted to take only what they could carry, and that included all their bedding. Seattle's Japanese residents were evacuated between April 28 and May 12, 1942. "They made us get rid of everything," recalled Jean. "Our home and all our belongings. My father had to give up his business. It was hard. My parents had worked so hard to get where they were. I had to give up my book collection and all the things that were dear to me. I even had a doll collection, and I couldn't take that with me. We had to leave our friends. It was so sad. We couldn't take any personal belongings with us. We had kittens. I had to give up piano lessons." We cried. Seattle's Japanese residents were taken initially to the temporary assembly center set up at a state fairgrounds at Puyallup, Washington, 35 miles south of Seattle, where they lived for 4 months while waiting for the permanent camps to be built. The War Relocation Authority hastily built 10 remote internment camps to house the 122,000 Japanese who were forced to leave their homes and businesses. The camps were located mostly in the western states, although 2 were in Arkansas. The camps, which were hastily built wooden barracks, were in isolated and inhospitable places, far away from concentrations of other Americans. The isolated locations also meant little publicity on what was happening to the Japanese. In September 1942, the Kanno family and the others from Puyallup boarded trains and traveled east for 30 hours. They then boarded buses for the final leg of their journey. They finally arrived at Camp Minidoka in southern Idaho. The camp was 20 miles northeast of the city of Twin Falls in the southern part of the state and encompassed over 34,000 acres of high desert, sagebrush, dirt, heat, and cold. The Minidoka Relocation Center became a city of 600 bare wooden structures covered with tar paper and spread over 946 acres of high desert. It was designed to accommodate 10,000 people, but that number was possible only by forcing inhabitants to live in tight, overcrowded spaces. The size of a small city of 10,000, it was in the middle of nowhere. Cramped, isolated, essentially, it was a prison. Spread out in a crescent shape, like the stands of a Major League Baseball stadium, were 36 blocks of barracks. Each block consisted of 12 individual barracks, holding approximately 250 residents. There was a mess hall, a laundry, and a sanitary building, and a recreation hall in each block. The Kanno family lived in Block 21, circled in red just to the left of the center of the map. In time, the agriculturally gifted Japanese internees planted massive community gardens sprawling across 243 acres along the eastern edge of the camp. It was well maintained by the Japanese. They raised a diverse mix of vegetables, all of which were used in feeding the camp residents. They also created ball fields for the children. Each barrack building was 20 by 120 feet and was divided into individual units to hold multiple families. There was no privacy for family members in the living quarters. The rooms were barren, save an army cot for each person and a coal-burning stove for heat. The buildings provided only 50 square feet of living space per family member. The separate living spaces had only one bare light bulb. Families were responsible for acquiring their own furniture for their living space. Some used scrap lumber to create tables and chairs. Others ordered furniture from the Sears Roebuck catalog. Certain barracks were designated for schools. After a delay, they finally opened. Jean attended her final years of high school at Camp Minidoka. It was given the name Hunt High School. In the photo, the students from Jean's high school are working on the ground just outside the barrack classroom. The young people had fairly normal lives. It's just that they were lived in very isolated areas with a very Spartan existence. Camp inhabitants ate in the various dining halls throughout the camp. There was an unfortunate dynamic of eroding family cohesiveness, as the young people in each family preferred to eat together with their friends instead of their family members. At the left is a photo of the Minidoka Irrigator weekly newspaper from March 13, 1943, which highlights that 300 Japanese men from the camp volunteered for military service. Japanese men were recruited back into military service by 1943 due largely to a great need for soldier replacements in combat zones. The Japanese Nisei citizens in the relocation camps were required to register for the draft. They were called to fight for the freedom of others and were imprisoned if they refused to do so, even though they themselves were denied that same freedom in the internment camps. By the end of the war, and to the credit of the Japanese Americans, over 30,000 Japanese Nisei had served in the U.S. Army, most of them in the European theater. The Kanno family's ticket out of the internment camp at Camp Minidoka eventually came through older daughter Mary. Mary was not forced into an internment camp because she was a student at Washington State University, which was located east of the Cascade Mountain Range. She met a chaplain from the University of Michigan at a Baptist camp in Wisconsin where she had been invited to spend the summer playing her music. He befriended her and took an interest in helping her family get out of Camp Minidoka. He advised her to transfer to the University of Michigan, and he would then arrange for her family to be relocated to Ann Arbor. In early 1945, after 2.5 years of internment, the Kanno family finally left behind a life of confinement and began their next chapter. Jean enrolled at Michigan State Normal University, which has become Eastern Michigan University, where she undertook teacher training. She graduated with an art education degree in 1949, and then taught art for a year in a school in Portland, Oregon, where she was able to be reunited with some former friends from Seattle. When she returned to the Midwest, she married George Umemura in 1950. They had briefly met while they were living in Seattle, but he was 3 years older. They became reacquainted while Jean was in Ann Arbor. Following college, George moved to Bloomington, Indiana, to attend the Indiana University School of Business, where he earned his MBA in 1948. He became an instructor there and was accepted into the doctoral program at the IU School of Business. George graduated with his doctorate in business from there in 1952. George was among the first Japanese-American students to be welcomed back to the campus at Indiana University following its ban on such students during the war. In 2018, 75 years after George's enrollment at IU in 1946, the story of Japanese internment and discrimination resurfaced on the campus of Indiana University in Bloomington. While the University of Michigan offered enrollment to select Japanese students like Mary Kanno during the war, Indiana University in Bloomington did not. In May 1942, the university's Board of Trustees issued a ban on accepting any students of Japanese descent. The ban, which lasted until September 1945, barred the enrollment of at least 12 Japanese American students who had applied to IU during the war years. Only 630 students, about 1/5 of the total 3,252 Japanese Nisei enrolled at West Coast institutions in 1941, were able to gain the sponsorship of a handful of college administrators and thus avoid the concentration camps altogether. Approximately 3/4 of American institutions denied admissions to Nisei students during the war. In 2018, fourth-generation Japanese-American student Eric Lankowski was in his last semester at Indiana University when he discovered IU's ban on Japanese student enrollment during the war. Remembering that his grandmother had gained her freedom from internment through her acceptance of enrollment at a university in Kansas, he organized a Day of Remembrance event on the IU campus to coincide with the February 19 date of President Roosevelt's Executive Order of 1942. During that event, he formally requested that IU issue an apology for their ban on Japanese students. He later wrote an extensive report on the ban, which was published in the June 2019 Indiana Magazine of History. 2 years later, on February 19, 2020, Lankowski again issued a plea for the Indiana University Board of Trustees to offer a formal apology for the ban. This time, he handed them a signed petition which had the backing of the Japanese American Citizens League National Council. In November 2021, IU finally addressed the university's discrimination against the 12 Japanese American students who were denied admission. As part of that admission, they declared they would host a Day of Remembrance panel discussion in February 2022, as well as offer a new course focused on Japanese internment during the war. They also created the Masuji Miyakawa Scholarship for 12 underrepresented students, representing the 12 Japanese students who had been banned from admission during the war. And they pledged to create a commemorative space that publicly acknowledged IU's regret for the ban. The commemorative space includes a white boulder with an attached plaque and a bench in a small triangular green space between the Herman B. Wells Library and the Hamilton Luger School of Global and International Studies on the campus of Indiana University. The space is located on the south side of 10th Street, next to North Eagleson Avenue. The plaque reads, "This commemorative space is dedicated to the Japanese American students who were wrongly denied admission to Indiana University between 1942 and 1945. Indiana University regrets its failure to meet the needs of these students, for whom college would have meant freedom from prisons in which they, together with 120,000 other Japanese Americans, were forcibly incarcerated. The racial hatred that drove their unjust imprisonment is antithetical to the fundamental values of Indiana University, and this space is intended as a reminder of our shared commitment to social justice and equality." Dedicated November 12, 2021. While the plaque is small, its presence and intent convey the power behind three small words that Lankowski and thousands of other Japanese had been waiting to hear and see. We are sorry. The U.S. government slowly but finally issued its own apology to the Japanese Americans who were interned during the war. 31 years after the conclusion of World War II, in 1976, President Gerald Ford signed Proclamation 4417, in which he stated, "We now know what we should have known then, not only that evacuation was wrong, but Japanese Americans were and are loyal Americans." 12 years later, in 1988, over 36 plus years after the sad chapter of evacuation and internment, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, acknowledging the error of the government and the injustice to the Japanese who were confined, and offering reparation payments in the amount of $20,000 for surviving internees. But by that time, many of the internees had already died. Thankfully, George and Jean Umemura lived long enough to see the day when apologies and reparations were awarded to former Japanese internees. After getting married, they lived on the East Coast for a short time before coming to Indianapolis, where George worked at Eli Lilly Company and Jean taught 5th grade at Allison Middle School for 30 years. The couple was blessed with 3 children. Years later, while their children were in high school, they noticed a sidebar story on Japanese American internment in their history books. The kids asked the parents if they knew about this, to which the parents responded, "Yes, we were there." They went on to share their experiences with their children. Jean began then sharing her experiences with her 5th grade students that she was teaching. Later in retirement, both Jean and George traveled to area schools to share their experience as Japanese American internees. Learn more about the Japanese Memorial Band Marker and the story of Jean and George Umemura in my new book, World War II Indiana Landmarks, available for purchase on my website or wherever books are sold. And while on my website, check out my trilogy of Indiana World War II service stories. Thanks for tuning in to this episode.